I was repairing the loose hinge on the kitchen cupboard when the phone rang. A small, ordinary sound that felt like a pebble tossed into a still lake, spreading ripples through a quiet evening that didn't deserve them. And when I saw the photographer's name on the screen, a man I'd already paid, thanked, and filed away under one more job done, I answered with a smile I didn't keep for long, because his voice came through thin and pressed, like it had been squeezed through a fist, and he said, "Sir, I noticed something terrible," and I felt my fingers stiffen around the screwdriver. A simple tool suddenly heavy as a verdict, and I said, "What do you mean?" And he replied, "Please come immediately, and don't say anything to your daughter." And I didn't ask another question, because there was a warning folded inside his words, a kind that men recognize without needing a second line. So I left the hinge half fixed, the cupboard ajar like a mouth caught mid-confession, grabbed my keys, and stepped out into the evening where the sky hung dull and unremarkable, a cover that had no intention of telling me what waited beneath it. And as I drove, the familiar streets lifted like a map of old habits, every turn plucked from muscle memory, except my chest thudded with a new rhythm, a pulse that wanted to be caution but felt more like fear catching up to a man who thought he had outrun it. Because it had been 1 month since her wedding, 1 month since I'd watched her walk away on a carpet of petals and promises laid out like a future, a month in which I'd convinced myself that everything was finally in its place, that I had done my duty, smiled at the right moments, swallowed the rest, and now the phone call tore open the seam I believed was sewn shut, a seam I'd stitched with my own trembling hands. And outside the photographer's studio, with its flickering sign and a glass door smudged with ghosts of hands that had come to claim memories, I paused, noticing how my reflection looked suspended and unsure, as if I didn't fully belong to the man who had arrived to complete this errand. And when he let me in, he didn't offer tea or small talk. He just led me to the back room that held a smell of ink and machine heat, and the stale echo of too many stories pressed into frames, and he pulled down a blind to shut out the late light, then turned on the monitor with a click that felt surgical, and I found myself leaning forward as if my body wanted to confess something my mouth didn't yet know, and he brought up a folder, wedding, final, then another, unsorted, then a third named review, urgent. And when the first image loaded, I saw my daughter, luminous in a way that makes men believe the world can still be kind, her smile a delicate bridge between two families pretending to be a single land, and I felt the old ache of pride and loss together, the same pain every father carries quietly like a folded letter in his pocket, thinning over time but never thrown away. And then the photographer zoomed in, not on her face, not on the groom, not on the garland or the laughing guests, but on the background where people blur into pleasant atmosphere, and there he was, still, dark, uninvited. And I would call him a stranger if it were not for the shock of a recognition that wasn't recognition at all, more like a chord struck in the room that made the air go tight, because the man stood with a kind of stillness I have only ever seen at funerals, a stillness that announces itself not with movement, but with refusal to move. And while the guests around him leaned into joy like weather-bending trees into dances, he held himself separate, a blade set upright in grass, and the photographer whispered, as if the stranger had ears inside the photo, "He appears in 5 different shots," and clicked through them, each time the same expression, the same angle, the same uncanny presence. And then the 5th image stopped me, because his left wrist caught the light just so, and something shone, something round and familiar, a small face with scratches at the edge like a ring that had survived too many winters, and I felt my throat tighten, my heart searching for a place to hide. Because the watch on his wrist was my father's, the old steel one with the dent near the 2, the one I never found after the day we scattered the old man's ashes and packed his shirts into silence. And I had said to myself, perhaps it was lost, or perhaps someone took it by mistake. But the truth was I had thought about that watch every month for years, the same way I thought about all the things that go missing in families without ceremony, the way secrets slip off tables and into pockets that nobody checks. And now the watch glinted at me from the stranger's wrist with the rude confidence of a claim I had not approved, and I said, to no one, to the dust, to the machine, "That's impossible." And the photographer said carefully, "There is more," and pulled up another photo where the stranger was closer, not because he had moved, but because the camera had. And in that proximity his eyes troubled me, not for their shape or color, but for what they carried, a kind of intent that fathers know even when they pretend not to, a gaze that had been trained not on my daughter or the groom or the celebration, but on me, as if I were the one being married off, the one walking away, the one under examination. And a chill scuttled across my back like a small animal avoiding the light. And I thought of the guest list, printed and cross-checked, of the names I had rehearsed and the faces I had approved. And here was a face that did not ask for permission, a face that stood where family should be but wasn't, and the photographer exhaled, a slow, guilty sound, and said he had noticed it during the final pass, that he had almost ignored it, that he had thought it might be a trick of focus or a harmless onlooker. And then he had watched the man's eyes, frame by frame, and understood that nothing about this was harmless, that something had been placed inside my daughter's wedding like a seed of rot buried under petals. And he said again, "Please don't tell her." And I nodded with a heaviness that felt like consent to something I didn't yet understand. And as we sat there, two men staring at a stranger who had snuck into our joy, I realized this wasn't just about a watch or a face. It was about the way betrayal enters a home, not always through the door, not always announced, sometimes just slipping into photographs and choosing a wrist to haunt. And I thought about my wife's quiet glance during the ceremony, the way she had looked away when I tried to meet her happiness, the way she had held her breath as my daughter walked past. And a small thought, mean and persistent, began to scrape at me, a question about who invites whom in families, about what we pretend is chance and what is design. And I wanted to ask the photographer to print the image, so I could take the stranger home and ask him to sit at my table, place his wrist beneath our light, and explain himself. But I didn't. I just stared until my eyes stung, then stood, thanked the man for his vigilance, and stepped back into the night where the world looked normal again, and yet everything inside me had been twisted a quarter turn, just enough to make the familiar feel like a room rearranged without warning. And as I drove home, I didn't play the radio, didn't call anyone, didn't let my thoughts run ahead like children. I kept them close, disciplined, counting the snaps of the indicator like a rosary, because I knew I was walking toward a conversation I would have to pretend wasn't a confrontation. And when I reached the house, the cupboard still hung open like an accusation, and my wife asked if I had fixed it. And I said, "Not yet." And she looked at me with a softness that knew the difference between hinges and heartaches, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that takes root the first time it finds water, that whatever the stranger was, whatever the watch meant, whatever the photographer had brought into my evening, it had not come from outside our family but from within it, and betrayal, I realized, does not always knock. Sometimes it calls that I told myself I would sleep before doing anything reckless, but the photograph had arrived like a trespasser that refused to leave, and it sat in my mind on a chair pulled too close, watching me. So I went to the study and closed the door gently, the way you close the lid on a box that may bite, and opened my laptop to the folder the photographer had sent. And for a long moment I watched the loading bar creep like a hesitant confession across the screen. Then the first image appeared, radiant, properly composed, the sort of memory we buy to reassure ourselves that we managed one perfect day. But my eyes did not stay with my daughter's smile or the groom's polished posture. They wandered like hunted animals to the edges where truths often hide. And there he was, the stranger, as if the pixels had grown around him, not added by accident but anchored by design. And I tried to tell myself stories men tell when fear is inconvenient. Maybe he was a staff member. Maybe he had wandered in. Maybe he was a friend of the groom. But each excuse collapsed under the weight of his gaze, that cold alignment aimed not at joy but at me. And then the watch, my father's watch, winked in the light like a small, cruel joke, as if the old man had decided to attend his granddaughter's wedding wearing someone else's wrist. And I felt my mouth go dry with a grief that did not belong to the dead, but to the living who learned too late that the rooms they love are shared with secrets. So I enlarged the frame until the stranger's skin was grain, until his eyes were a pair of storms bottled by glass. And I imagined asking my father what it meant to see his watch on a stranger's arm. But the only answer I could hear was the memory of the old man's silence during our last argument, the way he had smoothed his mustache instead of forgiving me, the way he had looked at the floor like it owed him an apology, and I realized with a shiver that the watch was not a relic, but a message, a thread pulled through years of quiet and tied at the wedding to force my hand. And when my wife knocked softly and asked if I was coming to bed, I lied with a voice I couldn't recognize and said, soon, because I didn't trust the night to guard us if we slept. And after she left, I pulled out the guest list, the one I had printed twice and corrected like a stubborn exam, and I traced each name with a finger that wanted to tremble but didn't. And still the stranger waited in the margin, unnamed, unclaimed, the sort of presence that belongs only to the person who refuses to confess it. And I thought of my daughter, of the way she hugged me just before walking down the aisle, whispering, "Thank you, Baba," and how gratitude can be a cloth thrown over a wound. And I asked myself whose wound we had covered with garlands, whose truth we had dressed in white. And the answer I feared was that we had thrown a wedding not for love, but for its appearance, a performance grafted onto the skeleton of a family trying to keep itself upright with polite lies. And the stranger was the audience member who had refused to clap, who had stood up, wearing my father's watch, to insist that we look at the stage and see the wires, see the actors, see the bruise on the script, and for the first time since the call, I let myself think the ugliest thought, that someone inside my house had invited him, and I did not know whether to dread my wife's softness, my daughter's radiance, or my own need to be right. Because betrayal does not stand apart from love. It feeds on it, like a parasite that can only survive inside warm bodies. And before I could stop myself, I remembered the night 2 months before the wedding when my wife returned late from final fittings, her phone battery dead, her breath carrying a trace of perfume I could not name. And my mind, obedient to fear, began stitching a story with the thread of doubt. A story in which the stranger was not random but relevant, not guest but ghost, not threat but proof. And still I hated myself for thinking it, because marriages, like rooms, are built on the ability to walk past certain doors without opening them. And now here I was with a key in my hand cut by a man I barely knew, only because he had cared enough to notice, and that care felt like an indictment as much as a favor. So I called him, the photographer, and asked, with a steadiness I did not feel, whether there was anything else, anything he had held back out of caution or kindness. And he was quiet for a beat that lengthened like a stretch of road just before a cliff, then said, "There's a clip," and emailed it, and I watched it load. A moving image now, a piece of the day distilled into 27 seconds of proof. And it opened with my daughter turning toward the crowd, the confetti falling, our faces a map of staged joy. And then the camera panned, casual, slow, and the stranger came into frame like a winter entering a window that had been left cracked. And for 2 seconds his eyes met the lens, and I felt a jolt, because it was not the look of a man observing. It was the gaze of a man acknowledging an arrangement, the brief, satisfied nod of someone who knows his presence is not an accident. Then the clip ended as if it were the throat clearing before a speech that never gets delivered, and I replayed it, counting the frames, punishing myself with the intimacy of scrutiny we reserve for the guilty and the beloved alike. And finally, I shut the laptop and sat back in the chair my daughter had bought me last winter, the one she had teased me for calling too soft. And I stared at the ceiling and asked the dark to behave, and it did not, because darkness is loyal to no one. And when I finally slept, my dreams were not mine but the stranger's, a sequence of rooms I entered only to find him already there, standing in corners, holding out his wrist, offering me my father's time like a debt. And morning arrived with a clatter of cups and the smell of tea, and my wife greeted me with tenderness that hurt, the way a bandage hurts when it still has a wound under it. And I said nothing about the stranger, because silence is a tool as sharp as accusation, and I needed hers to cut into the truth. So I watched the small rituals of our household, the way she placed the cups, the way she avoided the cupboard I had left unfixed, and I wondered when we had started arranging our intimacy around what we could not say. And then my daughter called, bright and easy, asking about Sunday lunch, and I felt a tremor of cowardice, the urge to say yes and pretend the world could be ordinary if we wore the right smiles. But I said I would call her back, and when I ended the call my wife asked, "Is everything okay?" And I looked at her long enough to force the question into the air between us. Like a third person we both had to acknowledge, and I answered with a truth that sounded like a lie. "I don't know." And her face flickered with something I had seen once before, The night she told me her brother had borrowed money and never returned it, a look that understands betrayal not as a shock, but as an installment plan, and I realized we had grown old paying installments on small treacheries, and now a larger bill had come due, carried by a man wearing my father's watch, and somewhere behind all that was the possibility that I, too, had invited him, not with a call or a card, but with years of choosing to look away, to let my wife carry her unsaid things, to let my daughter believe that love without questions is safer than love with answers. And if betrayal is a debt, then innocence is the credit we extend to keep the lights on, and I felt those lights dim as I stood and said, I need to see the guest list again, then walked back to the study where the folder waited, and I opened it like a priest opening a confession, and I began to do what I should have done before the wedding. Read the names not as entries in a social ledger, but as maps of allegiance, history stitched into polite print, and as I reached the groom's side, my finger stopped on a name I had skimmed without attention, a name that belonged to a man my wife once introduced as an old family acquaintance, a name that, when Googled in a moment of weak curiosity, revealed photographs of a wrist with a dented steel watch. And I did not move for a long time, because grief is a heavy coat, and I had just put it on, and when I finally staggered to the door, I knew the strangest thing. The photograph that wouldn't let me breathe had not come to punish me. It had come to save me from a future built on suffocation, and saving hurts, because it breaks the walls we pretend protect us. And I stepped into the hallway to find my wife waiting, her eyes steady, like someone who has decided at last to open a door. And I understood that the day had begun not with tea, but with a reckoning, and that the stranger in the photograph was either the knife or the mirror, and in both cases, he was ours. The name on the guest list sat there like a needle buried in cotton, harmless until touched, and once touched it pricked. It drew a small bead of memory that had nothing to do with weddings and everything to do with evenings in our drawing room years ago, when my wife had introduced him with a smile that asked me to be polite. An old family acquaintance, she had said, the kind. A phrase that folds history into a napkin and places it where knives should go. And now the same name stared back from the groom's side of the list, neat and unassuming, positioned between cousins and colleagues as if it belonged. And I understood too late that belonging is often the first disguise betrayal wears. So I carried the printout into the living room where my wife stood with a firmness that made all my questions feel juvenile. And I held the page between us like a curtain and said, his name, softly, as if saying it too loudly would summon something I wasn't ready to see. And she didn't flinch. She didn't reach for a lie or a delay. She simply closed her eyes, the way women close their eyes when grief is a private visitor they've been expecting, then opened them again with the weary grace of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times in the quiet of her own chest. And before I could sharpen my words, she said, "You should sit," a sentence that turns men into children, whether they obey or not. And I sat because my legs were suddenly unreliable, and she began to speak not from a place of defense, but from the kind of honesty that punishes itself. She said the man had been part of her brother's circle once, back when young men mistook risk for brilliance and called it ambition, and that they had started something together, a business that traded on favors and signatures and the confidence of people who believe that family is insurance, and the insurance failed, and money went missing, and with it went the watch. I blinked, I leaned forward, I felt the room tilt, because she said the watch went missing from our house, years ago, on a night when her brother had come with this acquaintance to discuss terms, to plead, to bluff, to drink tea in cups that didn't deserve to hold such slippery promises. And I remembered an old unease I had buried under gentleness, the way a man buries his instinct when the people he loves ask him for softness, and I understood that the stranger had not found my father's watch at random. He had taken it or accepted it or used it as collateral in a game whose rules were set by someone inside our family. Someone who had believed, for a foolish moment, that time itself could be borrowed to repay a debt, and I felt a heat rise in me, a heat that wasn't anger yet, but wanted to be. It wanted to burn names and bridges and the guest list itself. And I asked my wife the question I feared most. Did you invite him? And she took the weight of it like a stone and placed it carefully between us, then shook her head. No, she said, but I knew he would come, and that knew was worse than invited. That knew was acceptance dressed as inevitability. a thin consent wrapped around the hope that if we pretend long enough, reality will get tired and leave, and I felt betrayed not by the presence of a stranger, but by the absence of my wife's trust in me. The way she had kept a corner of our home for secrets that she watered without sunlight. And still, even in that injury, I could hear something else. Her attempt to protect our daughter from a stain that had already seeped into the fabric of our lives. And I wanted to hate her for that. I wanted to call it vanity or cowardice, but I knew that love often chooses silence because it cannot choose violence. And I am a man who has also chosen silence when speaking felt like tearing. So I asked for the rest, for the story that sat under the name like a root. And she told me that when the business collapsed, the acquaintance, this man, did not disappear. He lingered in their orbit like death itself, turning up at places where joy was expected, reminding them that nothing ends just because we want it to. And when our daughter's engagement was announced, he sent word through the groom's family that he would attend. Not a threat, not a demand, just a presence declared in advance. And they, too, had reasons to permit such declarations, reasons that made my wife's lips press together, and I thought of the groom, of his immaculate manners, of the way he had called me Baba with endearing insistence, and I wondered if he had known, if he had colluded, if he had stood there on the stage smiling while a man wearing my father's watch moved through our crowd like a shadow of unpaid history. And the thought made my stomach knot, because betrayal is not a single act but a tangle, each strand pulling the next into a mesh that catches everyone who walks near it. And I remembered the clip, the 2-second nod into the lens, the acknowledgement of arrangement, and my blood cooled into something like resolve, because if arrangement existed, I would break it. If a design had been laid over our family like a transparent film, I would lift it and find the hands that placed it there. So I stood, slowly, carefully, and told my wife I needed to speak to our daughter, and she said, "Not yet." And I ignored her tone not because it lacked wisdom, but because I was drowning and wanted to call out to the person I had taught to swim, and I dialed my daughter's number, and she answered with that sunlight she carries in her voice, asking if I wanted the bakery's new almond cake for Sunday. And I said her name 3 times, softly, as if saying it once would not be enough to place her firmly inside the truth I was about to peel open. And she fell quiet under those 3 gentle insistences, then said, "Is something wrong?" And I thought of the morning after her wedding, the way she had slept late in our house one last time, her hair loose, her face unadorned, her phone screen lighting up with messages she hadn't read yet. And I felt a grief so tender I almost dropped the call. But grief is not permission to delay. So I asked if she knew the acquaintance, and she said no. Her surprise genuine, her confusion quick, and I believed her. But belief is not proof, and proof is a cold necessity. So I asked whether the groom did, and she hesitated, the kind of pause that is honest and dangerous, and said, "He mentioned an investor once, a family friend who helped in a bad time, but he didn't give details." And the word investor scraped my ear like a false note disguised as a compliment. And I saw, then, how families launder harms by dressing them in respectable nouns, how we say business, investor, acquaintance, and let the blood dry inside syllables that look clean on invitations. And my daughter asked me again what was wrong, and I said I needed to see her, now, and she said she could come by in an hour, and I said bring your husband, because if he was a thread in this tangle, I wanted to pull gently but firmly, to test the weave without tearing it in public. And after I hung up, my wife touched my sleeve and said, "Please be kind." And I felt annoyance rise like steam, because kindness felt like the wrong instrument for surgery. And yet I knew that unkindness poisons the hand before it reaches the wound. So I told her I would be as kind as truth allows. And we waited, the house taut as a drum, every sound amplified. And when our daughter arrived, she hugged me in the doorway, her cheek pressing against my shoulder with an ease that threatened to undo me. And the groom followed, his smile careful, his eyes scanning our faces with professional empathy. And we sat. No tea, no sweets, no small talk. Just the table between us like a court that had convened without invitation. And I told them about the stranger, about the watch, about the name that sat where family should be. And I watched the groom's face like a hawk watches the field, not for movement, but for intention. And his eyes did something I have seen in men who are about to tell the truth and hope it will be forgiven. They steadied, they chose their ground, and he said, without theatrics, that his family had indeed accepted help at a crucial time, that the man had stepped in with money and confidence when banks turned away, and that this help had come with a cost that was not purely financial, a cost measured in presence, in proximity, in the right to stand at occasions like a creditor counting plates. And he said he had wanted to tell me, that he had thought about it, but he had feared my reaction, and he had feared losing my daughter, and every fear suddenly felt like a thief that had been invited to dinner, and my daughter's hand found mine under the table, a small, shaking anchor thrown into a sea that did not promise to be kind. And I realized with a cruel clarity that betrayal here was not a plot hatched in darkness, but a series of courtesies extended to the wrong people, politeness paid like rent to history we should have evicted, and the stranger had stood where family should be because we, collectively, had left room for him. And the watch on his wrist was not just theft but punctuation, a sentence that said time belongs to those who claim it. And I decided that if time could be claimed, then it could be reclaimed. And I asked the groom for the man's number, and he gave it, and my wife's breath caught like paper in a flame, and I dialed in front of them, because cowardice often flourishes in privacy. And when the line connected and the voice on the other end said my name like a greeting rehearsed for years, I knew we had finally entered the room where betrayal would either be made to kneel or would demand we kneel to it. And in that moment, with all of us listening to a stranger in our home, I understood why he had stood in our photograph. He had come to be recognized, he said, my name with the confidence of someone who had practiced owning it. Syllables turned over until they felt like property, and for a heartbeat I forgot that the phone was a thin wire between us and imagined he was seated in my living room already, crossing one leg over the other, letting his watch catch the light as if truth were a stage, and he was the only actor prepared. And I hated that I noticed his composure even through a voice. Hated that men who harm also learn to sound like comfort. And yet there was a rasp there, too, a fatigue that belonged not to guilt but to familiarity with consequences, and it told me everything I needed to know. He was no accident. He was a habit, our habit, the kind you pick up with one weak decision and keep long after strength returns, because it fits in your pocket and nobody sees it until you take your hand out. And I said, carefully, almost politely, we need to talk. And he replied, we've been talking for years whether you knew it or not. A sentence that slapped me without raising a hand, and my daughter tightened her grip on my fingers under the table, while the groom sat straighter, a reflex that men use when they think posture can substitute for courage, and my wife moved one coaster, then another, organizing small circles as if order on the table could summon order in the room. And I told him he had stood at our wedding, that he had worn my father's watch, that he had watched me like a judge watches a defendant who pretends innocence. And he did not deny it. He asked instead, almost curious, did you finally see me? And the question bored into me, because it was not about sight but about acknowledgement, about the quiet contracts we sign with our silence. And I thought of all the times I had called discomfort dignity, all the times I had let others manage the family's edges because I preferred a smooth center, and I understood why his eyes in the photograph had looked like they remembered me. I had been the kind of man he counted on, the kind who would accept the arrangement so long as the arrangement did not make a mess on his shoes, and that realization disgusted me. So I leaned forward, as if the posture itself could stiffen my resolve, and asked him where he had gotten the watch, expecting a lie, a story, a shrug. But he said, simply, from your brother-in-law. And the groom exhaled, a soft release that sounded like relief and regret stitched together. And my wife closed her eyes the way you do when pain is old and shows up like an uninvited guest at breakfast, and I felt the heat of humiliation more than anger, because anger is sharp, it can cut, but humiliation is a flood. It soaks everything until your certainties smell like mildew. And I asked him why he wanted the watch, why he wore it, why he stood at my daughter's wedding as if time itself had chosen him. And he said, with the cruelty of honesty dressed as pragmatism, because debts are measured in hours as much as in rupees. And I like to keep, on my wrist, a reminder of who chose me. And the phrase, who chose me, lodged in my throat like a thorn, because betrayal is not just taking. It is consenting. It is signing. It is the handshake we pretend is forced but is often offered. And I understood, then, that he had not come to haunt us. He had come to be recognized as part of us, to claim his seat at the table we had set for family and friends. And in that sudden, devastating clarity, I saw my own reflection. Years of professional politeness, years of nodding past discomfort, years of letting my wife handle the dark corners because I preferred light, and lights, as it turns out, are how shadows decide where to stand. So I changed my voice. I made it a tool rather than a blanket, and I told him to meet me. Now, no theatrics, no lawyers, no audience. Meet me at my father's old house where the floors still creak under truth, and bring the watch. And he laughed, not cruelly, but in a way that suggested amusement at my sudden courage, then agreed, and the line went dead as if the phone itself were relieved to stop being a conduit for harm. And I stood, and the room shifted like a ship rebalancing after a weight moves, and my daughter whispered that she would come along. But I said no, because there are rooms where daughters should never see their fathers bleed, and the groom asked if he should join me, and I told him to stay, to explain to my wife what his family had traded and what they had bought, and I watched his face sag under the responsibility of confession, and I felt an ugly satisfaction, not because I wanted him to suffer, but because suffering is sometimes the only door through which truth agrees to enter. And I drove to the old house without the radio, without prayer, without the little comforts we use to cushion ourselves against reality, and the gate, rusty and offended, accepted my push with a squeal that sounded theatrical and wrong. And I stepped into the yard where my father had once measured plants with a soldier's patience, and the front door let me in like a tired aunt who knows you've come with bad news, and I sat in the drawing room where the old man had argued kindly, always kindly, because he believed kindness could outlast lies, and kindness can, but only if it remembers to carry a hammer. And when the stranger arrived, he brought city air into the old house, and his eyes were exactly as they were in the photograph. Calm, rehearsed, practiced on men like me, and the watch sat on his wrist like a dare. And I felt the room absorb his presence as if it had been expecting a guest who never sends an RSVP, because he knows no one will refuse him. And I asked him to sit, and he did. And I did not waste courtesy on water, on greetings, on the little rituals that let men avoid the large ones. I went straight to the wound, to the watch, and he slid it off, almost casually, as if it were a jacket in warm weather, and placed it on the table between us. The steel face scratched like a story told too many times, and I picked it up. And something broke in my chest, something soft, something old, something tender as a memory of my father lifting me over a puddle when I was a boy so my shoes wouldn't get wet. And then the stranger said what no therapist, no priest, no friend had ever said to me with this specific precision. I stood at your daughter's wedding because every family decides which deaths will be honored in public, and yours decided to honor mine. And I wanted to argue with the pronoun, with yours, to push him out of that circle and call him a trespasser, but the truth had already rearranged the furniture. He was in the circle because the circle had widened without my consent, but with my silence. And I asked him why he wanted to be seen. Why not take his pleasure privately like all parasites do? And he smiled. A small, weary, human smile that I hated, and said, "Invisible men do not get paid." And the sentence sliced through me without art, because sometimes the blunt truth is the cruelest. And I asked him what he wanted now, and he said nothing about money, nothing about interest, nothing about accounts. He said he wanted us to understand that until we disentangled ourselves, he would attend our milestones. He would be present at engagements, births, one-day funerals. He would collect his due in proximity, in acknowledgement, because the watch was not worth money. It was worth his right to exist inside our narrative, and I felt my stomach revolt, my hands tighten, and I said, quietly, dangerously, that the narrative ends today, that the watch leaves with me, that the debt may remain but the stage will not. And he tilted his head, studyingly, like a teacher pleased by a student who has finally arrived at the hard part of the lesson, and asked me whether I was willing to dismantle the polite agreements that had kept our family standing, agreements with in-laws who preferred quiet, with my wife who managed appearances, with myself who avoided scenes. And I saw the map of betrayal, saw how every path returned to my door because I had not locked it. And I said yes, not as a roar, but as a promise, and promises, when kept, are louder than shouting. And he stood, nodding, and walked to the window where dust wrote old poems on the sill, and said, "Then you will lose some friends." And I replied, Friends who stand next to thieves are not friends. And he turned, and for the first time his eyes softened, not with guilt, but with respect he did not intend, and I wondered if, in some other life, he could have been a man who loved cleanly, but in this life, he was the stain, and stains do not leave because you argue with them. They leave because you scrub, repeatedly, publicly, and I put the watch in my pocket, feeling my father's time press against my thigh like a blessing and a warning, and I told him to stay away from our home, that if he entered our photographs again it would be as evidence, not as a guest, and he smiled that small smile and left, driven by a car that looked too new for old debts, and I stood in the old house where my mother had once ironed my shirts with prayers, and I knew, with a terrible clarity, that eyes which remembered me too well had done so, because I had given them the opportunity, because betrayal thrives in the rooms we keep neat for visitors while letting the closets rot, and I drove back, feeling heavier but more honest than I had in years, and when I entered my home, my wife looked at my pocket the way women look at pockets that carry miracles or bombs, and I took the watch out and placed it on the table, and our daughter exhaled a sound that was half sob, half relief, while the groom stared at time like it had finally refused to be his partner in crime. And I said one sentence, simple, insufficient, but true. He's not coming to our house again. And then I prepared for the war that begins when a family decides to be clean. The watch lay on our table as if time itself had been dragged back from a grave and told to sit still, a round face that remembered more than any of us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that it didn't belong to the living, that it was a relic meant to guard the dignity of someone who had done his best to keep our home clean, and seeing it among our cups and our frightened eyes made me want to lock every door we had ever opened to appearances, because appearances had invited a man to walk into our photograph and claim a seat among us without permission, and I kept hearing the stranger's sentence, "Invisible men do not get paid," like a line scrawled on a wall I had ignored, a warning that we had treated harm as polite company, until it learned our schedules, our rituals, our smiles. And in that moment I understood that taking the watch back was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would cost us the soft illusions we had paid for with silence. So I told the groom to call his parents. Now. Not tomorrow, not after tea. Now. Because if debt had rented space in our wedding, it had done so with help from those who were supposed to guard the door, and he hesitated in that trained way in which men stall when asked to put their family under light. But my daughter's hands were clasped like prayer, and I would not let her kneel to anyone's arrangement. So I leaned forward and said his name in the tone fathers reserve for men who need to remember they've been allowed in, and he dialed. And the conversation was ugly, not in volume, but in the way the truth drains color from voices when it finally decides to stand up. His mother tried to soothe, to name the acquaintance of benefactor, to remind us of how one favor had saved them from ruin. And I asked her gently whose ruin was worth a man standing in my photograph wearing my father's time, and she fell quiet, a silence heavy with the knowledge that the price had been proximity, that our family had become the showroom where payment was performed, and when his father took the call, the thin courtesy collapsed into a stubborn insistence that real life is negotiations, that anyone who refuses negotiations will live lonely, and I felt a sudden, violent clarity that loneliness is better than living surrounded by hands that count your daughters as receipts, and I told him we would not negotiate with men who wore our dead's watch, and he said, soft and venomous, that these are modern arrangements and we should grow up, and I said, softer and more dangerous, that growing up is learning the difference between accommodation and surrender, and when the call ended, my daughter cried, not like a child, but like a woman who sees the scaffolding around her life and realizes it was built to support somebody else's pride, and my wife held her in a cradle of quiet, and I could feel my rage wanting to turn into theater, into gestures, into public outrage, but I remembered the old house and its dust writing poems about restraint, and I chose a colder weapon. I called my brother-in-law, the man who had turned our home into a market and my father's watch into currency, and when he arrived, breathless, apologetic already, forming the sentences he had used for years to make rotten deals sound like unfortunate necessities, I didn't sit, because chairs forgive men before they confess. I stood and I let the watch catch the light, and I told him I knew, and he tried to make shame into a performance, stepping toward the table with the practiced sorrow of someone who has learned to cry on cue, But my patience was done, the kind of done that hardens into steel rather than shattering into noise. And I asked him why. Not the cheap why of money, but the real why of loyalty. Why he had traded the old man's time for a favor. Why he had allowed a creditor to enter our celebrations as if joy had to pay tax. And he blinked. And he said the thing cowards say when their story collapses. I thought it wouldn't matter. And I felt the whole room tilt. Because every betrayal begins with that sentence whispered at a mirror. And I told him it mattered to the dead who trusted us. To the living who marry because they believe love can stand without crutches. To the child I raised to believe that her father would pull her out of any room that turned into a transaction. And he sagged. Not because I had punished him, but because punishment arrived wearing truth. And truth hurts in places no audience can see. Then my wife asked him a small question that was larger than anything I could have forged. Did you tell them he could come? And his eyes slid sideways toward the floor, the way eyes move when they look for a hole to hide their own face. And he said he hadn't invited him, but he had told someone that. Our family understood how these things work, and I realized the speed at which complicity travels, how a single sentence passed through 3 mouths can rewrite a family's boundaries. And in that rewriting you find strangers standing where a father should be, where a brother should be, where a clean promise should be. So I drew a line, not on paper, but on the floor of our house. And I told my brother-in-law he was no longer welcome here until he had paid his debts without renting our joy. Until he had learned that help buys nothing if it steals respect. And he tried to turn away the decree with jokes, with the small courtesies that men throw like flowers at funerals. But I let the decree stand. And he left, and the room filled with a new quiet, not relief, not peace, something more dangerous. The awareness that to stay clean we would have to become unpopular. We would have to lose the thick comfort of people who prefer stains to solitude. And I looked at the watch and thought of my father's hands, hands that measured seed and stitched buttons and never once hinted that love could be purchased in bulk. And I made a vow that sounded simple and landed heavy. We would not let our daughter's marriage be a tent pitched on borrowed ground. We would rebuild the floor, even if it meant tearing up boards that had been polished with tradition. And that afternoon I drove with the groom to meet his parents in person, because cowardice is a plant that grows tall in phones and shrivels under daylight. And we sat in their lounge where everything gleamed with the practiced cleanliness of people who outsource dirt. And I told them we were returning the money their benefactor believed paid for presents. We were erasing the ledger that kept our families tied to a man who collected attendance as interest. And they argued. They spun words. They tried to paint me as dramatic, as old-fashioned, as someone who didn't understand the way favors travel now. But I refused the new religion of necessary compromise. And I said that if their son loved my daughter, he would build a future without invitations extended to ghosts. And the groom, to his credit, spoke, finally. As if he had found his spine hiding under the furniture, he said he would dissolve the arrangement. He would pay what was owed without asking my daughter to carry those invoices in her eyes. And his parents looked at him with the stunned disappointment of people who realize their child prefers honor to strategy. And in that look I saw another betrayal, parents furious at their son for refusing to be a tidy beneficiary of someone else's stain. And for a moment I pitied them, not because they were right, but because pity is what you feel when a person chooses wealth over dignity and doesn't even notice the cost. And when we left, the groom's shoulders were set with a difficult, beautiful tension, and I told him plainly that love without courage is a festival, not a marriage, and he nodded. And I thought of my daughter's smile, and I wanted that smile to be a home, not a parade. And when I returned, my wife watched me the way women watch men who have decided to burn bridges in winter, worried for warmth, grateful for fire. And I placed the watch on the mantle, not as decor, but as a verdict, a small circle of steel declaring that time in our house belonged to the people who would spend it cleanly. And that night we ate together without guests, without anyone's name hanging in the air like unpaid rent. And my daughter asked if things would get worse before they got better, and I told her the truth. That worse is often the tunnel we walk through to reach better. And that betrayal is not corrected by apologies, but by architecture, by rebuilding doors, by choosing who may knock, by deciding who may stand in our photographs. And she leaned her head on my shoulder. And for the first time since the call, I felt the future enter the room on its feet instead of on its knees. And as I watched the watch mark seconds that no longer belonged to any creditor, I understood that the living can carry the dead forward only by refusing to trade their love for approvals, and that our family would have to learn the hardest lesson a polite house can learn. Mercy without boundaries is complicity, and complicity wears your father's watch until you take it back. Questions have a way of changing shape when you aim them at people you love. They start sharp, clean, righteous, then soften mid-flight and arrive as injuries you never intended to inflict. And that morning, with the watch ticking on the mantel like a metronome for courage, I looked at my daughter and felt an ache that made me want to abandon every question. Poor T. Pretend the world was manageable if we rehearsed the right kindness. But betrayal, once found, demands bookkeeping, and bookkeeping demands line items, and line items demand answers. So I asked her about the engagement party, the guest list, the weeks when the investor was mentioned in vague tones like a ghost invited for his money and tolerated for his manners. And she shifted, not evasively, not guiltily, but with the discomfort of someone who has learned how to keep peace by keeping quiet. And that realization stung me worse than any yes or no. Somewhere in our house, silence had been taught as a virtue when it should have been labeled a tool for thieves, and she pressed her palms together, her ring flashing in the window light like a promise trying to be brave, and said she'd only heard his name once. A passing reference, smoothed over by her husband with a "don't worry, it's not important." And because love trains the heart to accept small untruths when they come wearing gentle tones, she had believed it, tucked it away, and proceeded with joy like a disciplined soldier marching past a ditch. And I wanted to say something cruel about that. I wanted to blame her for choosing ease over inquiry. But the words turned to ash before they left my mouth, because what kind of father punishes his child? For believing in the world he built for her, for trusting the man he approved, for staying gentle in a room he was supposed to keep clean. And I breathed, counted the watch's seconds, remembered that anger is a useful fire only if you keep it off the people you're trying to warm, and asked instead about the photographer's clip, the stranger's nod, whether she had noticed any presence that felt wrong on her wedding day. And she closed her eyes and wept, a quiet that fell like rain on tile, small, consistent, unstoppable. And when the tears slowed, she confessed the thing that pierced me most. "Baba, I saw him once, near the staircase, but I thought he was one of the groom's uncles. You know, older men with quiet faces, they belong at weddings." So I smiled, and then I looked away. And there it was, the ordinary cruelty of betrayal. It dresses like an uncle. It learns the mannerisms of tradition. It stands near the staircase because that's where blessings and obligations pass each other like cousins. And I drew her to me, held her like the only fact in a room of theories, and whispered that none of this was her fault. But the whisper tasted like apology because fathers who wait to shout at the world only after it knocks become accomplices. And I knew I was late, and late hurts. And when she sat back, I asked her one more question, the one that would either make her hate me or save her. "If you had felt wrongness earlier, would you have told me?" And she flinched, not because she wanted to lie, but because truth was a blade she had never been trained to hold without cutting herself. And she said, "I didn't want to ruin things." And I finally understood the exact architecture of our family's betrayal. Everybody trying not to ruin things until the ruined thing turned out to be us. And I promised her, aloud, in front of the watch and the window and the small, domestic objects that had witnessed our polite failings, that we would rebuild a house where ruining things was permitted if it kept our names clean, where questions could come to the table, and eat before dessert, where silence would not be treated as maturity or devotion. And she nodded, eyes red and beautiful with the kind of clarity grief brings when it has finished stealing. And then the doorbell rang, and betrayal walked in on two polite legs disguised as her husband's parents. Their faces set in that expression families where when they intend to defend what they call practicality. And we sat again, the same table, the same chairs, and questions became currency, passing between us like bills, each one requiring signatures in the form of courage. And they tried, they truly tried, to explain the way their world had taught them to survive, how loans and favors and investors and acquaintances are the scaffolding of modern life, how the man had never done anything strictly illegal, how wearing the watch was tasteless but not criminal, how standing in photographs was a form of asserting a social contract rather than extorting one, and every explanation slid off the table and landed at my feet like a pet I refused to adopt, because what is legal is not the same as what is clean, and what is socially acceptable is often just a long, obedient bow to a rotten throne. And I asked them why their son had never once said, "This man will not stand in my father-in-law's house. My wife's joy will not be tallied by a creditor. My child will not grow up believing attendance is a tax." And they had no answer except the ugliest accurate one. We didn't think it would matter. And the symmetry of that sentence broke something small in me, like a thin plate held for years finally tapping the floor just hard enough to crack. And I saw the line that connected my brother-in-law's cowardice to theirs, a thread of convenience disguised as caution. And I told them we were returning the money. We were burning the bridge. We were choosing solitude over stain. And they looked at me the way modern people look at men who prefer dignity to network, like I was romantic and, therefore, dangerous. And then my wife did something that rewrote the air. She spoke, not to them, but to our daughter, telling her that her mother had kept quiet out of fear, out of a misguided attempt to protect, and that silence had been the worst gift she'd ever given, and that there would be no more gifts like that. And in the confession there was a strength I had not earned, and their faces shifted, unsure what to do with a woman who refused the script, and my daughter, trembling but standing, said she would not accept a marriage written in pencil by other people's debts. She wanted ink. She wanted lines. She wanted a map where every road was clear even if it led through hard neighborhoods. And for a second, just a second, I saw fear leave her eyes like a guest who finally acknowledges he has overstayed, and I felt proud in a way that made a measure of my guilt quieter, not gone, but quieter. And that dusk, I asked her the last question I had been saving for myself. The question no father wants to speak aloud. Did I fail you? And she turned my hand over and traced the lines in my palm as if reading a biography from skin, then said, "You didn't fail me, Baba. You only waited too long to win." And I sat with that sentence the way you sit with medicine that tastes bad but works, and decided that winning would begin now, immediately, in the unglamorous ways, that we would change numbers, block names, rewrite lists, throw out invitations, tell truths that would make us lonelier and therefore freer, choose to have fewer chairs and more boundaries. And as the night fell, the watch marking seconds that seemed finally to be ours again, the questions I had aimed at my daughter returned to me, softened and strange, revealing an answer I hadn't expected. She couldn't answer some of them not because she was ignorant or complicit, but because she was raised to believe that love is safest when you don't look under it. And I vowed, touching her shoulder, that in our house love would be safest because we would look under it, around it, behind it, and if it ever tried to hide from questions, we would ask louder, kinder, and if necessary more painfully, until it came crawling out clean. The guest list sat on the table like a polite lie that had learned to dress well, columns, addresses, neat ticks beside names we had blessed with invitations, and now every tick looked like a small betrayal winking at me. And as I smoothed the paper with my hands, I realized how easily families transform spreadsheets into forgiveness, how we circle certain names not because they deserve a seat, but because they carry a history we're afraid to challenge. And I told myself I would read it like a detective, not a host. But the problem with being a host is that you have spent years arranging the furniture of your heart to accommodate other people's shoes, and my eyes kept wanting to soften at familiar surnames, the kind that trigger recipes and laughter, and the myth that blood is an antidote to rot. Yet there it was, the line of names that had smuggled a stranger into our celebration, the groom's colleagues, investors, family friends, a category that should be audited by a court and not a caterer. And the longer I read, the more obvious the architecture became. Betrayal had not entered our home through a crack. It had walked in through a door we had labeled necessary. And every signature on the list was a vote in favor of keeping that door unlocked. So I began crossing out names, not angrily, not theatrically, but with the steady hand of someone who understands that a clean house is built on omissions. And my wife watched me with a quiet that did not ask me to stop, and my daughter brought a second pen, as if to say we would do this together, and the groom sat opposite, pale, swallowing, realizing that love sometimes demands a purge, and I told him, gently but without mercy, that every name on his side which belonged to the man's network would be removed from our future invitations, that birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, Births would not be attended by creditors disguised as uncles, and his face pinched with the pain of choosing between loyalty to a family's habits and loyalty to a woman's safety. And he said he understood, but understanding is a thin bridge that collapses if not walked on, and I asked him to call those people now, to tell them we were closing the door. And he hesitated like a good son trained to consult elders before introducing decency. And I told him decency is not a committee, it is a decision, and he dialed, one after another, and every conversation sounded like the same script read by different actors. Reassurances, then offense, then threats disguised as concern. Don't antagonize benefactors. Careful, son. You don't want to isolate yourselves. We've always been there for you. And each line made me marvel at the elasticity of language, how men can stretch words until they cover theft like blankets. And I felt the old, crooked urge to negotiate rise in me like smoke. But I drove it out by reading the list again, and caught another detail that had worn a mask. On our side, a name my wife had added quietly, a cousin who had always arrived with the acquaintance at functions, who had introduced him to our circle as someone you should know. And I felt anger lunge up like a dog, and I wanted to bite with it, but I paused, breathed, and asked my wife how that name had found its way onto our list, and she admitted what I already knew. She had been managing alliances, trying to keep the flow of relations smooth, believing that removing this cousin would make the wedding a battleground. And I saw in that confession the exact weakness betrayal exploits. Our preference for flow over substance, for ease over integrity, and I told her, not sharply but brutally truthful, that every flow leading to filth must be damned, and she nodded, and together we crossed out that cousin, and it felt like cutting a vein that had been feeding the wrong organ. And the room grew quiet with the realization that we were remodeling the skeleton of our social body. And then the doorbell rang, as if the guest list itself wanted to test our resolve. And who stood there but a pair of relatives from my side? Women who had married into a family known for hosting lavish events with questionable sponsors, their shawls heavy with gold, their words heavier with unsolicited advice. We heard there is trouble, one said, seating herself without being asked. And trouble, I thought, has excellent gossip networks, and they began the delicate ballet of intervention, the kind that looks like concern but smells like control.
Don't embarrass the groom's family, these men are useful, what's a watch? Let it go, and I felt the watch on the mantel twitch inside me like a live wire, and I told them we were redoing the list, and their faces rearranged themselves into the expression reserved for people who choose principles when parties are cheaper, and one leaned in and whispered that she could talk to the acquaintance, that he respected her, that she had influence, and the word influence hit me like a slap, because influence is how betrayal gets its manicure, it is the perfume sprayed on rot. So sensitive noses confuse it for lilies, and I stood, the first time in hours I let my posture become a weapon, and said we were not interested in influence, we were interested in absence, and they bristled, offended that the usual tools were being rejected, and I realized how addicted our community is to work around ethics, to deals made in kitchens while children play in the next room, to arrangements that turn us all into accountants of harm, and I told them plainly that anyone who brings that man into our home as a solution will find the door closed to themselves as a problem, and they left offended, and I did not apologize, and my daughter reached for my hand like a rope in a storm, and I told her storms are good if they wash away dirt that has stuck for years, and the groom continued to call, his voice growing steadier with each refusal, and my wife began writing a new list, not of names but of rules, simple, hard, clean, no one with business ties to the acquaintance may enter, no favors that require presents, no gifts that demand repayment in invitations, no seeding of ambiguity, no photographs with men who wear the dead's time, and as she wrote, I watched her reclaim authority in a house she had guarded with too much politeness, and it changed her face, it brightened something that had been dim under the pressure of pleasing, and I loved her with a fierceness that made me ashamed of how long I had left her alone in the mud of diplomacy, and then, because families break best when everyone gets their share of guilt, I called my own cousin, a man I had tolerated for years because his jokes kept the room easy, and I told him we were done with the acquaintance, and he laughed and said I was making a scene, and I said scenes are necessary when the play is dishonest, and he said I had grown dramatic in old age, and I said old age is when you finally count the cost of every compromise and find you cannot afford them, and he hung up with a bored goodbye. And I erased his name, and it hurt, because erasing people hurts, but pain is the price of disinfectant, and when the list had been carved down to its clean bones, we sat back and breathed, and the room felt larger, as if removing certain names had removed certain shadows, and my daughter asked the question that hovers over every purge, will we be alone now? And I told her we might be, for a while, and that loneliness is not empty if you have boundaries inside it, and that crowds are not full if you have none. And the groom looked at his new, reduced network like a man examining a garden he had trimmed too late, and he said he would plant fresh names, honest ones, and I told him gardens are slow but they reward patience, and one day we would look at a list and feel pride rather than relief. And as evening folded itself over the house, I realized the most astonishing thing: the guest list had not hidden a betrayal, we had hidden it by calling it culture, by calling it respect, by calling it family, by calling it just how things are. And now, with ink and spine and the watch ticking on the mantle like a small judge, we had begun to tell a different story about ourselves, one where we choose who stands in our photographs not by the favors they've extended but by the truths they refuse to sell. And the stranger, wherever he sat that night counting his losses and planning new entrances, would find that our doors had learned a new word. No, the call came just after sunset, when rooms grow honest because the light has stopped flattering them, and his voice was thinner than it had been the first time, as if the day had been squeezing him from behind, and he asked if he could come over, now, not tomorrow. And when a man who deals in memories can no longer bear his own, you open the door, so I did, and he arrived carrying a folder swollen with prints, the kind of folder that tells you truth needs paper because mouths break under the weight of it. And I took him to the study where the watch marked time with unbothered diligence, and he asked if we could turn off the overhead light, something about the glare making it harder to see what matters, so we sat in the dark with only a desk lamp painting half the table in mercy, and he breathed in that careful way people do when they are about to step into a confession they have delayed, then began. He had not simply noticed the stranger. He had been warned to ignore unnecessary faces, warned by someone from the groom's side weeks before the final delivery, warned in a tone that sounded like advice but carried the chill of instruction. And he had told himself that ignoring faces is easy because photographs are about the center where joy performs and not the edges where truth waits. But 5 images in, the edges refused to be polite, and the watch glowed like a small authority insisting on its own presence, and he could no longer pretend to be a clerk at Happiness who stamps documents without reading them. So he had catalogued every instance, every angle, every instance of the stranger's stillness, and then the messages began, anonymous numbers with polite threats, deliver as is, do not send previews, leave out the candid staircase shots, and that phrase stabbed me, staircase shots, because my daughter had seen him there once and had smiled, believing he was an uncle, and now someone was asking to erase that brief encounter from memory like it was a stain on linen. And the photographer, who had built a life on capturing the one day when families behaved like their best selves, had realized he was being conscripted to help a family continue being its worst without evidence, and he felt the shame hit him like a dirty wave. And I watched his fingers as he unfolded the prints slowly, each sheet a small rebellion against the order to forget, and he placed the staircase photo in front of me. There was my daughter, halfway between floors, holding her dress with 2 fingers, smiling at a man she did not know she was suffering for, and the man's eyes were not on her. They were tilted to the side, at the camera, that same nod, that same acknowledgement of arrangement. And the photographer said he had gone to the groom privately with his concern, had asked whether there was a person we should be aware of, whether any guest requires discretion, and the groom had gone pale and asked, trembling like a boy caught cheating on an exam, can you blur him? And the photographer had said he could, but something inside him refused, a coil of dignity that sometimes springs in men who thought theirs had rusted, and he told the groom he would not blur, that weddings are sovereign territory where the truth of joy has a right to stand unaltered. And the groom had begged, not with malice but with terror, and the begging had made him nauseated because it smelled like the long, generational cowardice our community bottles and sells as tact, and still he had chosen honesty, and that choice had cost him, because the anonymous numbers were not actually anonymous. They belonged to a cousin whose studio buys second-hand gear from men like him when they break, and the cousin had offered to help by taking over the edit. And when the photographer refused, invoices delayed, supplies withheld, quiet punishments accrued, and I felt a raw guilt then, because men like me hire artists to document our marriages and then leave them alone with the wolves we prefer to call relatives. And I told him I was sorry for what proximity to us had done to him, and he shook his head, not refusing my apology but refusing a verdict that made him a victim, and said he had chosen the right pain. And then he told me the worst part: he had found evidence that the stranger's path through our wedding had been mapped, not by chance or joy, but by choreography, a set of instructions sent to a waiter: stand near the stage at 9, move toward the staircase at 9:15, linger by the family's seats at 10, and the waiter, a boy with nervous hands who had come to the studio to collect his settlement payment after being dismissed for rudeness, had shown him screenshots and begged him to keep them safe. And I leaned back, dizzy, the way a man leans back when the ground shifts under his house without cracking the walls just yet, and asked who had sent those instructions, but the boy's phone showed only a number saved under a letter that promises anonymity and arranges humiliation, and I looked at my wife, who looked at the watch, and our daughter, who looked at the floor, and I realized we were not fighting a man, we were fighting a habit, our own habit of letting men like this attach themselves to our events under the alibi of usefulness. And the photographer pressed his palms to the table as if praying to wood and said he had come to ensure that if we were going to take a stand, we would do so with the evidence the world demands when you refuse its agreements, and he slid the screenshots across, then a flash drive with the original clips, unblurred, untrimmed, unkind, and I took them, feeling the weight not of plastic but of accountability, and then he told me a secret that felt like a confession that belonged to my house more than his. A week before he called me, he had visited the stranger's office to demand payment for his own delayed dues from a previous job with the same circle, and the stranger had greeted him with tea and charm and a photograph on the wall of a different wedding where he stood in the same posture, at the same relative distance from the bride, as if harm were a geometry learned and repeated, and the photographer had understood, in that strange, hard instant, that the man collected not just presents but patterns, that standing in photographs was his ledger, that every image was a stamp of authority on someone else's joy, and he could not unsee it, and he had left shaking with disgust, and had called me because he needed to hand back the narrative to the family it had been stolen from, and I sat there, the desk lamp turning our little circle into something resembling theater, and I felt the anger come back not as a shout but as a blueprint, because blueprints are how anger earns its right to exist, and I told him we would protect him, we would pay him immediately, we would send the evidence to anyone who needed it, but more than that, we would stop treating men like him as vendors and start treating them as guardians, because he had helped us discover the lie in our own guest list, and guardians deserve respect, not negotiable invoices, and he cried, briefly, a quick spill that embarrassed him, and I pretended not to notice, because pride should not be made to suffer publicly when it has just done a courageous thing, and when he left, the dark felt cleaner somehow, and I went to the living room and told my wife and daughter what we had, and my wife touched the flash drive the way a person touches a relic, and my daughter asked the question children ask when they sense a war becoming unavoidable. What will we do? And I said we would do what clean families do in dirty towns, we would go public enough to close the private doors harm uses, we would post the photographs if necessary, we would name the behavior without naming the victims, we would ask other families to reclaim their narratives, we would stop talking about investors as if they were godfathers, and we would invite fewer people to larger truths, and I saw fear spark in their eyes and then turn into resolve, and I felt the old weight of tradition that tells men to keep harm quiet because noise brings shame, and I snapped the spine of that tradition in my head, because shame is what happens when you choose reputation over repair, and repair had finally arrived wearing a folder and a lamp, and the watch ticked, and I knew this, with a clarity that made me ache. Confessions like the photographer's are only useful if they become confessions of our own, and we were ready, in the dark, to begin saying aloud the sentences that would make our invitations fewer. Our photographs emptier of strangers, and our daughter's life full of a kind of peace that doesn't rely on expensive guests to look real. Truth doesn't always arrive in a hostile car or a shouted message, sometimes it rings your doorbell with the unconscious arrogance of kin, and that evening the bell chimed and my wife's face tightened because she knew whose shoes scratched our doorstep that way, and when I opened the door, my cousin stood there, the same cousin I had erased from the list like a stain lifted by patience, his mouth already shaping apologies that sounded like sales pitches, and behind him trailed the smell of rooms where men agree on small betrayals and call them favors, and I wanted to shut the door, I wanted to deny blood its manipulative authority, but my daughter was watching and there are certain performances you must allow so that the lesson is visible when the curtain drops, so I let him in, and the living room bristled as if a cold wind had stepped from his coat, and I did not offer tea, because tea is the currency of evasion in our town. I offered a chair and the watch on the mantel, and he glanced at it like it was a witness he had hoped had died, then arranged his hands with the elegance of someone who thinks posture protects him from reality, and he began in that voice family uses when it wants to weaponize intimacy, by, you've misunderstood, this is not how these things work, you're making enemies, and I let him use up his polished lines until they flaked and dropped like paint from a damp wall. Then I put the staircase photo on the table, the stranger's eyes nodding into the camera like an employee checking in for a shift, and placed beside it the screenshots marked A, and my cousin's cheek muscles twitched the way a mask trembles when you refuse to help tie it, and he laughed, a small, brittle sound that pretended to be comedy and failed, and said it was all a misunderstanding, just a waiter, just instructions for smooth movement, and I leaned forward, and my daughter's hand found my wrist, and my wife's shadow fell across the table like a boundary, and I said his real name, not the home nickname that hides sins under affection, and I told him we knew, and he inhaled sharply because real names strip vanity, and I asked him why he had choreographed a creditor's presence at my child's wedding, why he had placed a man wearing our dead's watch beside our staircase, why he had turned our joy into a stage where debt could collect applause, and he said the ugliest true thing I have heard from a relative, because it keeps doors open, and open doors keep a family safe, and I felt my stomach seize with disgust because in that sentence I saw the architecture of our betrayal, blood building bridges for strangers and unclipping keys from our belts to hand to men who could corrupt our thresholds, and I told him doors that open to thieves are not safety but surrender, and he shrugged in that ancient, tired way that men who broker compromise shrug, as if the weight of our dignity were a negotiable cargo in his ledger, and he truly tried, to paint me as dramatic, as ruinous, as an elder who mistakes rigidity for honor, and all the while the watch ticked, the photographs waited, and the flash drive on the desk lamp's shadowed circle kept its quiet thread on behalf of our future, and then my cousin's face did something that made me both sick and strangely peaceful. It softened into confession, not because he had found his conscience, but because he had decided that telling the truth was a strategy that might still save his position in our home, and he said the stranger was not just an acquaintance, he was the spine of a network that had helped my brother-in-law, had rescued the groom's father during his collapse, had smoothed court dates for an aunt who borrowed beyond wisdom, had funded scholarships that arrived like gifts with invisible invoices attached, and he said he had arranged those interventions, had become the family's locksmith, and that he had been paid not in cash but in respect and access, and my skin crawled because respect and access are the currency parasites prefer, clean, silent, constantly replenished by our politeness, and he held his hands out, palms open, as if honesty absolves harm when you drop it gently on a table, and said he had ensured the stranger would never embarrass us, would remain a silhouette at the edges, a small price for survival, and he looked at my daughter as he said it. And that look did something to me I will not forgive. It assessed her like a detail in a spreadsheet, a line item that could be negotiated if necessary, and I moved my hand from her wrist to the table and flattened my palm because sometimes a father's hand has to become the law before the law can bother to arrive, and I told him there would be no more survival that asked my daughter to tolerate silhouettes. That safety purchased by letting a man stand near my family is not safety but complicity. And my cousin, finding no purchase in the usual slopes of the conversation, reached for my blood like a rope, reminding me of childhood, of shared shoes, of the time we broke a window and lied together, and his mouth turned the past into a plea, and the plea into a shield, and I cut it with one sentence: we did not lie together, we learned to lie together, and he froze, because he had never heard our nostalgia translated into accusation, and my wife spoke, her voice the steel I had been missing for years, saying that house rules had changed, that network is out and boundaries are in, that her daughter would not be photographed with any man whose money was made by bending families into gratitude, and my cousin's eyes, trained by a decade of minor conquests, flickered with calculation and then with something more dangerous, offense, ancestral offense, the kind that says you have insulted the family's way of surviving, and he warned us in a tone that carried the weight of every aunt who thinks she is a judge. You will be alone, and my daughter stood, and the flash of her ring cut a line of light across the photo's gloss, and she said, alone is better than surrounded by people who count me, and silence felt like dignity, finally, because sometimes the only sound you need to hear is your child refusing to be inventory, and still he tried. He said our refusal would kill future favors, will make weddings smaller, will turn hospital rooms stark, will deprive us of help when help is needed, and I thought of the hospital rooms where families gather and perform concern while bank transfers do the real caring, and I said we would reorganize our life around fewer chairs and more truth, and he sat back, and blood finally acknowledged that it could not bully us, and then he did something weak in its ugliness. He mentioned my father, implying the old man had known how to accept help with grace, how to hide the strings, and I felt heat rise from the floor through my bones because invoking the dead to justify living sins is a defilement, and I reminded him that my father's grace grew from clean labor, not from negotiations held in rooms that smell like ashtrays and entitlement, and the watch ticked in agreement, and perhaps it was silly to read agreement in a clock, but grief has permitted one superstition when it learns to be useful. And then my cousin delivered the final blow of his honesty: the stranger had demanded presents at our wedding because we were high value, our house still respected, our name not yet cheap, our photographs collected like stamps by men who trade in community reputations, and he wanted us in his album of usefulness, and I saw the geometry of humiliation, the way certain men construct scrapbooks of families as trophies, the way our faces become proof of their relevance, and I think I laughed, a small, incredulous laugh that tasted like iron, because the absurdity of being valued by those who devalue you is a madness only modern towns can sustain without collapsing, and I told my cousin to leave, to take his explanations and burn them for warmth elsewhere, that our doors had learned the word no and our photographs would learn it next, and he stood, insulted by the boarder, and said we would regret it, and I said regret is better than rot, and my wife walked him to the boundary like a guard, and he left, and the room changed, something lifted. A weight distributed by years of accommodating kin who had turned flexibility into complicity, and I sat, and my daughter came beside me, and the groom, who had been quiet but listening with the expression of a man counting his own debts, spoke and said he had ended the arrangement, called the stranger, returned the money, broken with his parents over it, and I watched his face for the crack where convenience might leak back in, and found, to my surprise, a seal of fear wrapped in courage, and he said he did not know what the future would cost him, but he knew what it would not cost my wife, and I gave him one nod, the kind that fathers give men who have decided to walk without sponsors, and later that night, when the house had settled into the new silence that honest choices build, my daughter asked whether blood can be trusted again, and I told her blood is a river, if you do not build levees it will flood you, and we were building, finally, and soon the phone rang, a different kind of ring, slow, heavy, my brother-in-law, weeping without performance, telling me the stranger had demanded presents at another wedding and he had refused, and for the first time he sounded like a man who had found his spine under a carpet of practiced apologies, and I said good, and I realized that truths walk in wearing your blood not just to hurt you but to force your blood to choose who it wants to be, and our blood, bruised and exhausted, had finally decided to be clean, and the watch on the mantel ticked like a small applause, and I knew we had one more part left to write, and it would be about architecture, not theater. Morning arrived without ceremony, the kind of pale light that slips into a house after a storm and finds furniture slightly moved, air newly disciplined, and the watch on the mantel kept time without asking permission, a small circle of steel insisting that the hours ahead belonged to those who would spend them cleanly, and I stood in the doorway of our living room, looking at the photographs we had taken down, frames empty like mild ghosts, and I understood with a clarity that made me ache that the wedding we hosted had never truly been ours to celebrate, not because our love was false, but because our boundaries were, and love without boundaries is a banquet where strangers rewrite the menu while the family blesses the food, and I told myself this day would be about architecture, not theater, about building doors that say no without trembling, about putting bolts on the cupboards where we used to store our silence, and my wife joined me with the quiet strength of a woman who has spent years keeping the walls upright while the men admired the paint, her eyes steadier now, her mouth set with resolve rather than apology, and our daughter, still bruised in places only she could feel, came out holding a stack of envelopes we had prepared last night, letters to relatives and erstwhile family friends explaining that we were reducing our circle, that we preferred small gatherings with large truths, and the groom, pale with the cost of courage, arrived early, carrying a folder of bank documents that severed what remained of the debtor's leash, and when he placed it on the table, something soft inside me sat down and rested, because to watch a young man choose honor over network is to witness a kind of birth that no hospital can record, and we began, one envelope after another, each one a stitch on a wound that had been allowed to gape for years, and I wrote a sentence I never thought I would send to people who had eaten in my home. Your presence has been kindness in some seasons and corrosion in others, we will accept the kindness and decline the corrosion, and my hand did not shake because truth, once it learns to stand, steadies the wrist, and by noon we had sent the messages, the emails, the small, brutal declarations, and the house hummed with that odd music only hard decisions make, a low, persistent courage that replaces the opera of gossip, and then I did the thing I had been delaying because ritual requires its own kind of spine. I took the staircase photograph, the one where my daughter smiled at a silhouette she believed was kin, and I posted it to a narrow, deliberate audience, those who needed to see, not those who wanted to gawk, attached to a short statement that did not name the man but named the behavior. We are reclaiming our family's photographs from the economy of presence. If your business requires standing in other people's joy, it will not find shelter here. And within minutes replies began arriving, some supportive, some anxious, some furious in that way people get furious when you refuse their favorite methods of survival, and I ignored the fury because anger has never paid a bill in our home except the ones it writes against our dignity, and I watched the supportive messages with a tenderness that surprised me, notes from fathers who had swallowed similar poison, from daughters who had smiled at silhouettes only to find invoices beneath their wedding cakes, from photographers who had blurred men for fear of losing work and promised never to blur again. And one line struck me deeper than the rest: we thought our wedding was ours too, thank you for reminding us to collect it, and I realized the architecture we were building was not just for us, it was a map other families could trace in pencil first, then in ink when their hands learned not to shake, and as the day advanced, calls came, some of them from blood that had chosen anger over self-examination, and we let them ring out into quiet, because answering every demand is how you end up living in a conference instead of a home, and there was a knock. I did answer, the photographer, who returned not for money but to bring a copy of the unblurred album, printed with care, the edges clean, the colors disciplined, the truth present like a subtle watermark, and he placed it on the table. And said something I will remember until my last hour, "This is yours. Keep all of it, even the parts that hurt," and I realized memory, like love, becomes dignified when you refuse to curate it for comfort, and we thanked him, paid him, promised our names would stand beside his when other families asked who recorded our honesty, and when he left the door felt more solid than it had in months, and then, near evening, a message arrived from the stranger, not a threat, not a plea, a single line that revealed the shrunken soul of the trade he practiced. Attendance is leverage. You have removed it, and I stared at that line until it stopped trembling in my chest, and I understood the simple math of our town. Men collect leverage by attending events they did not earn, by wearing watches they did not inherit, by standing near staircases where women practice walking in dresses their mothers adjusted, and we had cut that string, and if cutting cost us chairs and introductions, then it cost what needed to be paid, and I wrote back not to him but to myself, in a small notebook I keep for sentences worth repeating. Attendance is not love. Presence is not permission. Proximity is not family, and with those 3 refusals planted, we sat down to dinner, just us, plate simple, conversation honest, and my daughter asked the question she thought would scar me, "Baba, if the wedding was never ours to celebrate, what was it?" And I answered without performance, "It was a rehearsal for the marriage we're about to learn, one built on boundaries instead of banners, on courage instead of crowds." And she exhaled and smiled, a quiet, new smile that did not ask the room to applaud, and later, when the house dimmed and the watch drew lines through the evening that felt like roads instead of sentences, I went to the old house, alone, needing to measure the distance between grief and resolve, and the gate complained like always, but less, as if the rust had discovered the value of friction, and I sat in the room where the stranger had placed the watch on the table, and I thought of my father, not of his death, not of his lectures, but of his labor. How dignity, for him, was not a word but a repetition, a practice, a thing built one minute after another until time itself respected the workmanship. And I promised him with the quiet that men use when they want the dead to hear without being disturbed, that I would keep his time clean, that our photographs would be invitations to joy, not invoices for favors, that the doors of his house and mine would learn to prefer cracks from storms over hinges loosened by compromise. And when I returned, my wife was on the balcony reading the list of rules we had written, and she looked beautiful the way houses look when the scaffolding is gone and the walls show their true faces, and the groom slept on the sofa with relief in his posture, and our daughter had arranged the album in a stack that began with us laughing at the doorstep, no strangers in the frame, only us, and I knew the truth without needing to practice it out loud. The wedding was never ours to celebrate, but the marriage is, and marriages, unlike weddings, belong to the people who build them daily, to the couples and the parents and the children who choose to be poor in favors and rich in boundaries. And I turned off the last light, placed the watch in a wooden box that had never held anything worth locking until now, and whispered to the house, "We are done being hosts to other people's leverage," and the house settled, grateful, and I lay down knowing the photographs we take from here on will be unremarkable in the way cleanliness is unremarkable, and that unremarkable is a reputation worth guarding, and that our daughter will walk stairs without smiling at silhouettes, and if a stranger ever comes near, he will find a door that does not recognize his name, and if blood ever tries to sneak him in, it will be reminded gently and hard that rivers may flood but levees stand. And the last thing I heard before sleep took me was the watch's quiet applause, time agreeing at last to be ours.